Silence! You are accused of witchcraft.
Forget everything you think you know about medieval witch hunts. Were they really just chaotic scenes of mobs running through villages, burning innocent women by the thousands, with priests standing by to shout curses and condemnations? That is the version of the story most of us have heard repeated in novels and movies and even in classrooms. But the truth, when we take a slower look, is not nearly so dramatic and not nearly as terrifying. It is more subtle, more human, and in many ways more calming than the myths suggest. What you are about to hear is not a tale of endless flames, but of people, of beliefs, of fears and misunderstandings that slowly grew into legends. If you find yourself drifting with us tonight, a quiet like or subscribe would mean a great deal. And if you feel inspired, leave a little note in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where your eyes are closing? One of the most common myths is that millions of people, mostly women, were burned alive in the Middle Ages. The number is often repeated without question, and it creates a picture of villages emptied out, of whole regions consumed by panic. But historians who have spent decades studying the records tell us something very different. The number of executions across the entire span of Europe, from the later Middle Ages into the centuries that followed, was not in the millions. It was far fewer, perhaps between 40,000 and 60,000 over many generations. Still tragic, still cruel, but not the catastrophic scale that popular imagination has painted. The myth of mass death grew later, fueled by writers and reformers who wanted to make a point, and by storytellers who found that a darker legend was easier to pass on than a quieter truth. But what was a witch to a medieval person? When we use the word today, we imagine a figure out of folklore or Halloween decorations, a crooked hat, a broomstick, a black cat. Yet in the Middle Ages, the word meant something different, and often something much smaller. A witch could be someone who was thought to use charms, or to whisper words over an illness, or to mix herbs into a remedy that might heal or might harm. Sometimes a witch was simply a neighbor who was not trusted, or someone who lived on the edge of the village and seemed strange. In many places, these so-called witches were not feared at all. They were sought out for help, asked to bless crops, or to protect animals, or to comfort families in times of sickness. To accuse someone of witchcraft was not always to say they were evil. It was often just to say that they were suspected of meddling with unseen forces in a way that others did not fully trust. What might surprise you most is the way the church itself viewed witchcraft in much of the medieval period. We might expect priests and bishops to have been the ones fanning the flames of fear, but the truth is more complicated. For centuries, many church leaders dismissed witchcraft as nothing more than superstition, something that belonged to the ignorance of peasants. There are even early texts in which church authorities wrote that those who believed witches could fly through the night skies, or meet with demons in secret gatherings, were themselves deceived. In their eyes, witches had no such powers. The real danger was not sorcery, but the foolishness of believing in it too strongly. Of course, this does not mean the church approved of charms or spells. But in the medieval centuries, witchcraft was not yet treated as a vast conspiracy against God. It was often classified alongside petty crimes like fraud or dishonesty. If a case did reach authorities, it might be punished with a fine or an order of penance or banishment. Death was rare, especially in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. The great fires and mass trials that so many people imagine came later, in a different world, shaped by new fears and new pressures. Still, among villagers, suspicions lingered. Imagine the rhythm of medieval life. Small farming communities, every neighbor watching the other, survival depending on trust and cooperation. If a cow died suddenly, if milk turned sour too quickly, if a child fell ill with no clear reason, the mind searched for answers. Sometimes the answer landed on a neighbor. Perhaps she had looked at the child strangely. Perhaps she had argued with the family a week earlier. Gossip began, suspicions grew, and before long, a whisper of witchcraft was added to the story. These accusations were rarely about great battles of good and evil. They were about small quarrels, jealousies, and fears. They were about human tensions playing out in villages where everyone's actions were visible and where even small disruptions felt heavy. And so the story of medieval witch hunts begins not with fire, but with small human moments. A suspicion here, a quarrel there, a healer misunderstood, or a ritual misinterpreted. When we imagine the Middle Ages as a time of constant burnings, we are imagining the wrong picture. The reality was quieter, slower, and filled with everyday struggles that occasionally spilled over into something larger. The truth is that the full scale of witch hunts with courts and manuals and organized trials did not emerge until much later, near the end of the medieval world and the dawn of the early modern period. The centuries we call medieval were, in many ways, the beginning of the story, not its fiery climax. This does not mean there was no suffering. There was suffering and there was cruelty, but it happened within a more ordinary, more human scale than legend suggests. To see this story clearly, we must slow down and let go of the myths that grew over time. We must see witches not as monsters or millions of victims, but as neighbors, as healers, as outsiders, and sometimes as scapegoats in a fragile world. As we move forward, we will look more closely at what a witch really was in the medieval imagination, how magic and religion were woven together in daily life, and how suspicions sometimes turned into trials. But for tonight, let this first step rest in your mind. The myths are large and heavy, but the truth is smaller, gentler, and more human. The story is not here to frighten you. If we are to understand the truth about medieval witch hunts, we first need to ask a very simple but important question. What exactly was a witch in the mind of a medieval person? Today, when we use the word, an image rises instantly. A crooked figure in dark clothing riding on a broomstick through the moonlit sky, a black cat sitting on her shoulder, perhaps a bubbling cauldron close at hand. This picture comes to us from centuries of folklore, art, and popular culture, but it would have been foreign to many living in the medieval world. For them, the idea of a witch was far less theatrical, far less magical, and often far more ordinary. In small villages scattered across Europe, the word witch might mean nothing more than someone who was thought to use charms. These charms could be little verses whispered over an injury, or strings of words spoken softly to protect a family or a field of grain. A witch might also be someone who was skilled with herbs, gathering plants from the forest to make remedies for illness, or powders to soothe pain. In other cases, the word might be thrown as an insult, to mark someone who was strange, unfriendly, or difficult. In short, a witch was not necessarily a figure of terror, but a neighbor, a healer, or sometimes simply an outsider. In many cases, these people were sought out for help. A family with a sick child might visit the local woman who knew which plants eased fever. A farmer might ask her to bless his cattle, or to say a few words over his seed before planting. Magic and prayer were not sharply divided in the medieval imagination. A blessing could sound like a spell, and a spell could sound like a prayer. What mattered most was not the exact words spoken, but whether the community trusted the person speaking them. Trust and suspicion, reputation and rumor mattered far more than any clear definition of witchcraft. Still, there was always a line that could be crossed. If the healer's herbs worked, she might be praised. But if her remedies failed, or if sickness grew worse, the same family who once asked for her help might begin to whisper against her. If the cattle thrived, she was useful. If they sickened and died, perhaps she had cursed them instead. In a small community where everyone's fortune was bound together, suspicion could spread easily. A sideways glance, a muttered word, a past quarrel, any of these might be remembered at the wrong time and turned into an accusation. This fragile balance of trust and suspicion meant that the figure of the witch was never stable. She might be needed one day and feared the next. In some records, we even find men called witches, often when they practiced healing or divination, or when they were accused of interfering with the weather. The medieval world did not limit witchcraft to women, though over time, women came to be the majority of the accused. In the beginning, however, a witch could be anyone who was seen as meddling with unseen forces. We also need to remember that the medieval imagination was filled with the supernatural. People believed in saints and relics, in angels and demons, in holy wells and sacred places. Life was not separated into the natural and the magical, Instead, the two flowed together. A relic of a saint might heal the sick, while a witch's charm might do the same. A priest might bless a field, while a cunning woman might bury a charm in the soil. Both acts lived in the same mental world, a world in which unseen forces were constantly at work, shaping the visible world. When we look back, we often try to draw clean lines. We want to say this was religion, this was superstition, this was medicine, and this was magic. But for the people who lived then, those lines were not clean. To them, the world was full of powers, some holy, some dangerous, and many simply mysterious. The witch lived within that world, not outside it. She was one more thread in a tapestry where the sacred and the ordinary touched each other constantly. And so when someone was called a witch, the meaning depended on the story being told. Sometimes it meant wise woman. Sometimes it meant deceiver. Sometimes it meant healer or meddler or scapegoat. To be a witch was not to belong to a single, fixed category. It was to be caught in the shifting winds of community opinion, sometimes raised up, sometimes torn down. This fragile, unstable place in village life helps us understand why accusations of witchcraft could appear suddenly, even after years of quiet living. A woman might be respected for decades until one quarrel or one misfortune turned neighbors against her. A man might serve as a healer until his remedies failed too often, and someone decided he was more dangerous than helpful. Witchcraft was not a fixed identity. It was a label that could be given or taken away depending on circumstance. This makes the story of witches both more ordinary and more haunting. We are not speaking of shadowy figures hidden in forests, plotting evil. We are speaking of neighbors, people who lived and worked alongside others, people who were trusted until the moment they were not. In this way, witchcraft was not about secret cults or covens, at least not in the Middle Ages. It was about the fragile bonds of community and how those bonds could turn into suspicion when misfortune struck. As Christianity settled deeper into the life of medieval Europe, the question of how to treat magic and witches became more pressing for church leaders. At first, as we have seen, there was some tolerance or at least a sense of dismissal. Many bishops and priests considered witchcraft to be nothing more than foolish superstition, unworthy of serious concern. They did not see witches as powerful agents of the devil, but rather as gullible people deceived by their own imagination. Yet over time, as theology developed and the church sought to define the boundaries of truth and error, the way witchcraft was viewed began to shift. One of the most influential early voices was that of St. Augustine, writing many centuries before the height of the witch hunts. Augustine argued that while demons existed and could tempt or harm people, witches themselves had no real power of their own. If they claimed to fly through the air at night, or to change their shape or to control the weather, this was not because they had magical abilities, but because demons tricked them into believing it. For Augustine, the true danger was not the witch herself, but the lies of the devil. This teaching meant that for a long time, the church saw witchcraft less as a crime of power and more as a sin of foolishness, a weakness of belief. This perspective shaped much of the medieval church's approach to magic. Official church texts often described accusations of witches flying at night or meeting with spirits as delusions. The Canon Episcopi, an important church document from around the 10th century, insisted that such beliefs were false. It declared that women who thought they rode out at night with the goddess Diana or with spirits of the dead were simply being deceived, and that anyone who believed such stories was straying from the truth of the faith. Far from calling for burnings or executions, the text urged priests to teach their flock gently, to correct them, and to remind them that only God had true power over the world. For centuries, this was the dominant attitude. Witchcraft was not a grand conspiracy, but a small mistake. It was treated almost as a matter of ignorance, not as a threat to the order of Christendom. When witches were punished, it was often lightly, through confession, penance, or sometimes a fine. The real focus of church courts and inquisitors in these centuries was heresy, not witchcraft. Groups that challenged the authority of the church, such as the Cathars in southern France, drew far more attention and far harsher penalties. Witches, for the most part, remained on the margins. Still, theology is never fixed. and as time passed, new concerns began to grow. The belief that demons were active in the world was not in question. Medieval Christians lived in a universe where angels and demons were constantly at work, influencing events both great and small. The church taught that demons could tempt people, lead them astray, and cause harm. If witches were seen as collaborating with demons even in ignorance, then the suspicion around them became heavier. What began as a matter of foolish superstition slowly started to look more dangerous. To understand why the idea of witches carried such weight in medieval communities, we need to drift even further back, into the older layers of belief that shaped the European imagination long before the witch hunts began. Beneath the surface of medieval Christianity, there were older traditions, whispers of rituals tied to the land, echoes of gods and spirits that had not fully vanished. The people of the Middle Ages lived in a world where Christianity was dominant, yet remnants of earlier practices survived in quiet corners of life. These remnants shaped how people thought about magic, about healing, and about the unseen forces that might help or harm them. Across much of Europe before Christianity took hold, there were rituals tied to the seasons. The sowing of crops, the harvest of grain, the return of spring, and the quiet stillness of winter. Each of these moments carried ceremonies meant to honor the powers of nature. Fertility rituals sought to ensure good harvests and healthy animals. Charms were spoken to protect children and travelers. Offerings were sometimes left in fields, in forests, or by rivers meant to please the spirits that dwelled there. To us, these may seem like small gestures, but to those who practiced them, they were ways of keeping balance in a world that often felt uncertain and fragile. When Christianity spread across Europe, these older traditions did not disappear overnight. Instead, they were reshaped. Festivals once tied to the cycles of the sun and moon were folded into Christian calendars. Sacred groves and springs were sometimes rededicated to saints. The practices of blessing crops or livestock continued, but the words changed. Instead of invoking old gods, people invoked the names of Christ or the Virgin Mary. The shape of the ritual remained even as the meaning shifted. Yet beneath it all there lingered a memory that certain acts, certain gestures, certain words carried power. This blending of traditions created a complicated world. On one hand, the church preached against pagan practices, warning that they were the work of demons. On the other hand, the people who lived in villages often saw no sharp line between what was Christian and what was older. A charm could include a prayer. A blessing might contain a trace of an ancient formula. A healer might cross herself while also reciting words passed down through generations. To them, it was not a contradiction. It was simply the way the world worked. And here, in this space between old and new, the figure of the witch began to take clearer shape. The healer who used herbs was not always suspicious in herself, but if she used herbs and whispered words that did not sound entirely Christian, doubt could arise. If her remedies worked, she might be respected. But if they failed, and her words seemed too strange, too close to forbidden practices, her reputation could turn. It is in this uncertain overlap between pagan memory and Christian teaching that many accusations of witchcraft were born. It is important to understand that medieval people did not think of their world as divided into natural and supernatural in the way we do today. To them, everything was connected. The earth, the sky, the weather, the body, the soul, all were influenced by forces both visible and invisible. Illness could be caused by poor diet, but it could also be caused by a curse. Crops might fail because of too much rain, but also because someone had wished them ill. To live in that world was to accept that unseen forces shaped every part of life. Older traditions found their way into daily life almost without notice. A villager might hang herbs in the doorway, not really knowing whether the practice came from pagan times or Christian blessings. Another might carry a charm in the pocket, a small object meant to ward off evil, perhaps engraved with a cross, perhaps with something older. These little acts of protection gave comfort, but they also kept alive the idea that some people had special knowledge of unseen powers, and where there was special knowledge, there was always the risk of suspicion. The church did its best to guide these beliefs. Priests often taught that all power came from God, and that charms and spells were empty, or worse, dangerous deceptions of the devil. Yet at the same time, the church itself blessed water, blessed crops, blessed marriages, and births. To ordinary villagers, it was not always clear why one blessing was allowed and another forbidden. This confusion gave space for accusations. If someone's practices seemed too strange, too tied to old ways, they might be called witchcraft. This confusion gave space for accusations. If someone's practices seemed too strange, too tied to old ways, they might be called witchcraft. If the same actions were done by a priest, they might be called holy. The difference often lay in who performed the act and whether the community trusted them. In this way, the shadow of the old pagan world did not vanish, but lived quietly in the background, shaping how people saw magic and witches. Fertility rituals, healing practices, charms against misfortune, all of these became part of the medieval landscape. And because they were woven into life, they could never be fully stamped out, even when authorities condemned them. They remained, sometimes hidden, sometimes open, always reminding people that the world was more mysterious than it seemed. This blending also explains why witches were sometimes seen not just as harmful, but as powerful. If someone could heal with herbs, perhaps they could also harm. If they could bless, perhaps they could curse. The line was thin, and crossing it was often a matter of perception. A healer who brought relief was welcomed. A healer who failed could suddenly become dangerous in the eyes of her neighbors. The same knowledge that gave her authority could also make her a target. And so, as the Middle Ages moved forward, the figure of the witch grew more complicated. She carried with her the echoes of older gods and spirits, the suspicion of church authorities, and the fragile trust of her community. She stood in the space between past and present, between blessing and curse, between prayer and spell. As we drift further into this story, we will see how the church's official position began to harden, how law codes took notice of witchcraft, and how trials slowly began to appear. But before we reach that point, it is enough to hold this image. The medieval witch as a figure shaped not only by her own actions, but by the deep history of Europe's beliefs, where pagan roots and Christian branches were still intertwined. She was not just a character of fear, but a reminder of the unseen threads that connected the medieval world to the older traditions that came before it. As Christianity settled deeper into the life of medieval Europe, the question of how to treat magic and witches became more pressing for church leaders. At first, as we have seen, there was some tolerance, or at least a sense of dismissal. Many bishops and priests considered witchcraft to be nothing more than foolish superstition, unworthy of serious concern. They did not see witches as powerful agents of the devil, but rather as gullible people deceived by their own imagination. Yet over time, as theology developed and the church sought to define the boundaries of truth and error, the way witchcraft was viewed began to shift. One of the most influential early voices was that of St. Augustine, writing many centuries before the height of the witch hunts. Augustine argued that while demons existed and could tempt or harm people, witches themselves had no real power of their own. If they claimed to fly through the air at night, or to change their shape or to control the weather, this was not because they had magical abilities, but because demons tricked them into believing it. For Augustine, the true danger was not the witch herself, but the lies of the devil. This teaching meant that for a long time, the church saw witchcraft less as a crime of power and more as a sin of foolishness, a weakness of belief. This perspective shaped much of the medieval church's approach to magic. Official church texts often described accusations of witches flying at night or meeting with spirits as delusions. The Canon Episcopi, an important church document from around the 10th century, insisted that such beliefs were false. It declared that women who thought they rode out at night with the goddess Diana or with spirits of the dead were simply being deceived, and that anyone who believed such stories was straying from the truth of the faith. Far from calling for burnings or executions, the text urged priests to teach their flock gently, to correct them, and to remind them that only God had true power over the world. For centuries, this was the dominant attitude. Witchcraft was not a grand conspiracy, but a small mistake. It was treated almost as a matter of ignorance, not as a threat to the order of Christendom. When witches were punished, It was often lightly through confession, penance, or sometimes a fine. The real focus of church courts and inquisitors in these centuries was heresy, not witchcraft. Groups that challenged the authority of the church, such as the Cathars in southern France, drew far more attention and far harsher penalties. Witches, for the most part, remained on the margins. Still, theology is never fixed, and as time passed, new concerns began to grow. The belief that demons were active in the world was not in question. Medieval Christians lived in a universe where angels and demons were constantly at work, influencing events both great and small. The church taught that demons could tempt people, lead them astray, and cause harm. If witches were seen as collaborating with demons even in ignorance, then the suspicion around them became heavier. What began as a matter of foolish superstition slowly started to look more dangerous. The boundaries were never entirely clear. Many ordinary practices, blessings, charms, rituals for protection, looked suspiciously like magic, yet were tolerated if they came from priests or were framed in Christian language. The problem arose when such acts were done without the church's approval, or when they seemed tied to older, non-Christian traditions. At that point, the line between superstition and sin blurred. A charm spoken at a bedside might be dismissed as harmless, but if it contained words not understood, or if it was associated with pagan practices, it could become a cause for alarm. This tension between dismissal and fear marked the church's evolving stance. On the one hand, church leaders reminded the faithful that witches were powerless. On the other hand, they warned that demons were real and active. It was a delicate balance, and one that would eventually tilt toward greater suspicion as centuries passed. But in the earlier medieval period, the church's position was still closer to calm correction than to fiery condemnation. For the people living in villages, this meant that official church teaching often did not match the fears of daily life. A family might believe firmly that their neighbor had cursed their child, while their local priest might tell them that such beliefs were foolish. This gap between official theology and village imagination created an uneasy coexistence. The church did not encourage witch hunts, but the people's suspicions never fully disappeared. When misfortune struck, when disease spread, when crops failed, whispers of sorcery still moved from house to house. The church could insist that such things were illusions, but in the quiet of the village, the stories lived on. This gap also explains why the image of the witch was so unstable. She was, in one sense, powerless according to church teaching, yet she was powerful in the minds of her neighbors, who saw her as the cause of their misfortunes. In this space between theology and rumor, the seeds of later witch hunts were planted. The church was not yet calling for fire, but the idea that witches might be linked to demons was beginning to settle into the collective imagination. As we drift further into this history, it is important to keep this slow change in mind. The early medieval church was not obsessed with witches. It dismissed them, corrected them, sometimes punished them lightly, but rarely treated them as serious criminals. The great witch hunts lay far in the future. Yet the foundation was being laid. The belief in demons, the suspicion of older practices, the fragile trust of village life, and the slowly shifting stance of the church were weaving together. The threads were being spun, even if the full tapestry had not yet been revealed. And so, as you let these thoughts settle, picture a world where the church preached order and reason, while villages whispered of curses and charms. A world where priests taught that witches were powerless, yet neighbors still feared them. A world balanced uneasily between dismissal and suspicion. As we continue our journey, we will look at how these tensions began to move into the realm of law, and how medieval legal codes slowly started to define witchcraft, not just as a superstition, but as a crime. The story shifts from the realm of belief and church teaching into the slower but equally important world of law. For many centuries, witchcraft in Europe was not primarily a legal issue. It was seen as superstition, or at worst a kind of minor sin to be corrected by confession and penance. But law is where ideas begin to take shape in a more permanent form, and by examining how early medieval law codes treated witchcraft, we begin to see how suspicion slowly transformed into formal accusation. The earliest laws we find in the early medieval kingdoms, such as the laws of the Franks, the Saxons, or the Lombards, often mention magic in passing. These codes were written in a world still close to pagan traditions, where charms and spells were familiar parts of life. Many of the laws show concern less with the supernatural itself and more with the social disruption it caused. If someone was accused of using magic to harm another, the penalty might be a fine, just as it would be for theft or assault. In some cases, if a person was believed to have killed through sorcery, the punishment could be death, though this was rare, and often tied more to murder than to witchcraft as a separate crime. Interestingly, many of these early laws did not distinguish sharply between magical harm and physical harm. If a neighbor's cow died and magic was blamed, the case could be treated much like poisoning. In this sense, witchcraft was not yet seen as a spiritual rebellion against God, but as a practical danger to the community. The concern was for order and safety, not for heresy or the devil. Over time, as Christianity became more deeply woven into European society, church courts began to take a larger role in addressing accusations of magic. Secular rulers looked to the church for guidance, and the church, with its long tradition of teaching on demons and superstition, provided categories. The canon episcopi, which we discussed earlier, influenced many legal attitudes, reminding judges and priests that witchcraft was a delusion, not a real threat. This meant that for a long time, the legal approach to witchcraft was to correct, to guide, to impose penance, rather than to execute. Still, laws often reflect the anxieties of the time, and as fear of heresy grew, witchcraft slowly moved closer to that category. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the church was increasingly concerned with false belief, with anything that seemed to challenge Christian truth. Heresy was punished harshly, sometimes with execution, and though witchcraft was not yet placed fully in the same category, the connection was beginning to form. If witches were believed to be in league with demons, then witchcraft could be seen not just as a foolish superstition, but as a dangerous pact with evil. Secular rulers too began to notice. For kings and princes, accusations of witchcraft could be a way to assert order, to show their power over disorderly elements in society. Yet in this period, trials for witchcraft remained relatively few. Legal records show far more concern with theft, violence, and disputes over land than with witches. The great fear of witches as an organized threat had not yet taken hold. Instead, the law worked slowly, almost quietly, drawing witchcraft closer and closer into its net, preparing the way for the later explosion of trials. One important development was the growing use of inquisitorial procedure. In earlier centuries, trials were often decided by ordeals, such as holding hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water, with the belief that God would reveal the truth by protecting the innocent. By the 13th century, however, these practices were being replaced by careful questioning, by testimony, and by the authority of inquisitors. This shift made it possible to pursue accusations more systematically. Once witchcraft began to be taken more seriously, this legal framework allowed for wider investigations, longer trials, and more lasting records. At the same time, the line between healing and harm was not always clear in law. Many people practiced folk medicine, using herbs, prayers, or charms to cure illnesses. These practices were often tolerated, especially if they were framed in Christian language. But when something went wrong, when a cure failed or a charm seemed suspicious, the same person could suddenly be accused of witchcraft. The law did not always protect them, for it was shaped by the same uncertainties and fears as the culture around it. As we let this history unfold gently, we can picture the slow turning of a wheel. In the early laws, witchcraft is a minor concern, punished lightly, often confused with other crimes. As centuries pass, theology and law begin to intertwine. Demons become more central, heresy becomes more feared, and witchcraft moves closer to the heart of both spiritual and legal suspicion. Yet still, in this period, the great witch hunts have not arrived. The law is preparing the ground, but the storm has not yet broken. So, as you settle deeper into rest, imagine this long, unfolding process. Law codes written by kings in simple words, church decrees reminding people that witches are powerless, village courts weighing accusations of sorcery against the evidence of everyday life. All of it moves slowly, like a river carving its bed over centuries. In the next part of our journey, we will see how these slow currents of law and theology began to gather speed in the high medieval period, when scholars, clerics, and rulers started to link witchcraft more directly to the power of the devil. For now, let the story continue to carry you forward, softly and steadily, into the deeper night. As we follow the river of history into the high medieval period, something begins to change in the way scholars, theologians, and rulers think about witchcraft. For centuries, it had been seen as foolish superstition, something to be corrected gently or at worst punished lightly. But as intellectual life in Europe expanded in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the rise of universities and new systems of thought, witchcraft began to be drawn into deeper and darker conversations. The simple village suspicion was now being framed in sharper theological terms, and the whispers of sorcery started to sound more dangerous. The medieval universities, where scholars studied theology, philosophy, and law, became places where old ideas were re-examined in the light of new reasoning. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas carefully considered the role of demons in the world. Aquinas did not dismiss witchcraft as pure illusion. He believed that demons were real and that they could influence the natural world. He argued that humans, by making a pact with demons, might gain certain powers, though these powers always depended on the will of the demon, not on the person themselves. This was a subtle but significant shift. It suggested that witches could indeed cause real harm if aided by demonic forces, and that they were not merely deluded, but potentially dangerous allies of evil. This more serious view did not immediately lead to hunts, but it added weight to the conversation. What had once been treated as foolish superstition was now linked to heresy, to rebellion against God, and to demonic activity. In an age where the church was increasingly vigilant against heresy, this connection mattered deeply. The Inquisition, originally created to combat heretical movements like the Cathars, began to include witchcraft within its sphere of suspicion. Not often, and not yet with the fever of later centuries, but the seed had been planted. At the same time, European society was undergoing changes that made people more anxious about hidden enemies. The 13th and 14th centuries saw waves of crisis, famines, wars, and above all the devastating arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Entire villages were emptied, families wiped out, fields left untended. In times of such suffering, people looked for causes, and the idea that witches or sorcerers had brought disaster began to feel more plausible. Where theology provided the possibility of demonic aid, fear supplied the human faces to blame. It is important to see this not as a sudden leap into hysteria, but as a slow tightening of threads. Scholars were redefining witchcraft as something more serious. The Inquisition was broadening its scope. Ordinary people were feeling the weight of suffering and suspicion. Together, these elements wove a new picture of what witchcraft meant, darker than before. Even so, in the high medieval period, the great hunts still lay in the future. Most accusations remained local, tied to disputes between neighbors, quarrels over land, or suspicions about healers and midwives. Yet the language surrounding witchcraft was changing. Where once a priest might have called a woman deluded, he might now suggest she was in league with the devil. Where once a judge might have imposed a small fine, he might now consider harsher measures if demons were thought to be involved. The shadow of fear was lengthening, even if it had not yet fully descended. The church, too, was not unified in its response. Some clergy continued to echo the old teaching that witches were powerless. Others warned of growing dangers. This tension created a kind of uneven landscape. In one region, accusations might be dismissed as superstition. In another, they might be taken very seriously. In some courts, the punishment would be mild. In others, it might turn far harsher. It was a patchwork world, one in which the fate of an accused witch could depend more on local attitudes than on any consistent rule. As you listen, picture this shifting scene. Universities filled with scholars debating the nature of demons, inquisitors considering whether witchcraft should be treated as heresy, villages whispering after a poor harvest, rulers watching anxiously as disease swept through their lands. It was a world in transition, neither the calm dismissal of earlier centuries nor the fiery hunts of later ones. Instead, It was a time of uncertainty, when the meaning of witchcraft was being rewritten slowly, page by page. And so we drift further along this river of time, into a landscape where fear and thought intertwined. The witch was no longer just a deluded neighbor. She was becoming, in the imagination of the age, a possible conspirator with evil. The law was learning to treat her more harshly, theology was granting her greater significance, and ordinary fears were giving her more power in the stories people told. As we move deeper into the medieval night, the shadow that had been lengthening slowly begins to take on a more defined shape. It is in this period, the later Middle Ages, that the idea of witches gathering together in secret, in what came to be called Sabbaths, first began to emerge. This was not something found in the earliest records. For centuries, witchcraft had been seen as individual acts, a neighbor cursing another, a woman muttering charms, a healer accused of misusing herbs. But now the imagination of Europe began to picture witches not only as individuals, but as members of a hidden, organized community, bound together in service to the devil. The roots of this change are complex. Part of it came from the growing fear of heresy. In earlier centuries, heretics had been imagined as groups, conspiracies working secretly against the church, holding clandestine meetings, spreading false teachings. When witchcraft began to be drawn closer to heresy, it too began to be imagined in the same way. No longer just a solitary figure, the witch could now be pictured as gathering with others, sharing dark rites, mocking the sacraments, and swearing loyalty to demons. This idea was fed by inquisitorial records where confessions, often extracted under pressure, began to speak of meetings, of gatherings in forests or at crossroads. Whether these were real or the result of suggestion, fear, or torture, the stories began to circulate. Witches were said to meet at night, to fly through the air with the help of demons, to feast on unholy meals, and to turn all that was sacred upside down. The Sabbath, as it came to be known, was imagined as a mirror of the church's own rituals, but reversed, perverted, and devoted to evil. It is important to pause here and remember that this was largely a construction of fear. The records do not show widespread evidence of real organized gatherings. Instead, they show how the human mind, when faced with uncertainty, shapes its fears into images it can understand. Just as heretics had been imagined as forming sects, so witches were now imagined as forming covens. What mattered was not whether these meetings truly happened, but that people believed they could happen, and that belief carried enormous weight. For villagers, this new image added a deeper layer of dread. No longer was the witch simply the troublesome neighbor. Now she was thought to be part of a wider secret network. Her power was not just her own, but connected to something larger, darker and harder to fight. Every quarrel, every illness, every sudden death could now be linked not just to one person, but to an invisible group. Suspicion grew heavier, and fear spread wider. The church too began to take the idea more seriously. Manuals for inquisitors and confessors started to include questions about Sabbaths, about pacts with demons, about secret rites. The idea of a collective threat gave new urgency to witchcraft, for it suggested not just isolated sins, but a conspiracy against Christendom itself. To rulers and judges, this made witchcraft look more like treason than superstition, a crime against the order of society and even against God. At the same time, popular imagination embroidered these ideas with vivid detail. Witches were said to ride on broomsticks or animals, to fly through the night air, to meet in wild places, to dance and feast in grotesque parody of holy celebrations. Stories spread of infants sacrificed, of animals transformed, of the devil himself appearing in monstrous form to preside over the Sabbath. These images, though fantastical, gave shape to fear, and once they took hold, they were difficult to shake. And yet beneath these tales, daily life remained much the same. Most accusations of witchcraft were still local, rooted in quarrels and misfortunes. But now those local accusations carried the shadow of something larger. To accuse a neighbor was no longer just to say she had cursed your cow, but to suggest she might be part of a hidden army of the devil. The stakes were higher, the fear deeper, and the punishments harsher. So as we drift further along this story, let us imagine the shift. A village under the stars, whispers about a neighbor, fear of illness and crop failure. But now, those whispers are joined by darker rumors of secret gatherings in the forest, of fires burning at night, of voices chanting where no one should be. The imagination paints pictures that few have seen, but many believe. And once belief spreads, it becomes its own kind of truth. This was the stage being set for what was to come. The idea of the Sabbath, the collective witch, gave the later hunts their terrifying power. Fear of the individual had been transformed into fear of a network, a conspiracy that could touch anyone, anywhere. The ground was being prepared, the atmosphere darkening, the story moving steadily toward the hunts that would later sweep across Europe. In the next part of our journey, we will see how this growing fear began to crystallize in the 15th century, when writings, trials, and official texts turned suspicion into structured belief, and belief into law. For now, let the thought drift softly in your mind, the image of night, the murmur of voices, the imagined Sabbath in the forest. Shadows gathering, but still only shadows, as Europe dreamed darker dreams beneath the quiet stars. By the 15th century, the slow gathering of shadows had begun to take more solid form. For centuries, whispers of witchcraft had drifted through villages and courts, rising and falling with local quarrels and passing fears. Suspicions began to crystallize into something more structured, something more dangerous. The idea of witchcraft was no longer only a village rumor or a passing concern of theologians. It was becoming a recognized category of crime, written into official documents, pursued by inquisitors, and treated with growing seriousness by both church and state. The 15th century was an anxious time for Europe. The scars of the Black Death still lingered. Wars, famines, and shifting political powers left people uneasy. The church itself was troubled, with schisms that divided authority, councils that questioned papal power, and reform movements that stirred unrest. In such an atmosphere, fears of hidden enemies found fertile ground. Witchcraft, once seen as minor superstition, now looked like part of a larger battle between the forces of God and the devil. It was during this century that one of the most infamous texts on witchcraft was written, a book whose shadow still lingers in history. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, sought to define witchcraft in clear, terrifying terms. Though not immediately accepted everywhere, it gave official form to ideas that had long been building. It insisted that witches were real, that they made pacts with the devil, that they gathered in Sabbaths, that they harmed through magic, and that they deserved death. It provided instructions for detecting, questioning, and prosecuting them, and it did so with a chilling sense of certainty. This book did not create the fear of witches, but it organized it, gave it weight, and spread it widely. It marked a turning point, when the loose suspicions of centuries hardened into doctrine. What had once been a matter of local quarrels was now part of a grand struggle against the devil himself. The witch was no longer simply a troublesome neighbor, but an enemy of the faith, a traitor to God, a conspirator against all of society. Trials began to reflect this shift. In earlier centuries, punishments had often been mild, but now executions became more common. The methods of interrogation grew harsher, confessions more elaborate. Witches were said to fly, to feast with demons, to kill infants, to blight fields, to poison wells. Each trial added new details, and these details circulated, feeding the fear of the next trial. A self-reinforcing cycle had begun. Fear produced accusations, accusations produced stories, and stories produced more fear, more. Still, it is important to remember that this was not yet the full fury of the witch hunts that would sweep across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The 15th century was a threshold, a time of transition. The old world of dismissal and mild correction had not completely vanished, and in many places judges and priests remained skeptical. There were still regions where accusations were brushed aside, where the teachings of earlier centuries lingered, reminding people that witchcraft was delusion. But the balance was tipping. The weight of law, theology, and fear was beginning to press more heavily in one direction. In villages, the change could be felt in subtle ways. Where once an accusation might have led only to gossip or small penalties, it now carried the threat of trial, of interrogation, even of death. Ordinary quarrels became more dangerous, for the accusation of witchcraft had grown sharper teeth. A woman blamed for a sick cow might now find herself accused of darker things, not just harming her neighbor, but serving the devil. The image of the witch, too, was shifting. She was now pictured as old, poor, often a woman living on the margins of society. But she was also imagined as powerful, dangerous, connected to forces beyond the human world. This paradox, the weak neighbor who was also a servant of immense evil, gave the fear its peculiar strength. It allowed suspicion to fall on almost anyone, yet always with the sense that something larger was at work behind the scenes. As you let these thoughts drift through your mind, picture a Europe on the edge of transformation. Scholars writing books that turned whispers into doctrine, inquisitors compiling manuals that spread fear from village to village, judges weighing accusations with heavier hands than before, and ordinary people caught between superstition and law, watching the idea of witchcraft grow darker and heavier around them. This was not yet the great storm, but the clouds were gathering. The 15th century was the turning of the tide, the moment when fear began to rise, when the witch became a central figure in Europe's imagination. By the late Middle Ages, after centuries of scattered whispers and occasional accusations, something began to shift. Witchcraft, once treated as a minor matter of fraud or superstition, started to appear in the records of larger and more dramatic trials. These early cases from the 14th and 15th centuries give us the first glimpse of what would later grow into the wider hunts of the early modern period. In the alpine regions of Switzerland and northern Italy, suspicions of witchcraft began to take on a new intensity. The mountains, remote and often cut off by snow, bred close-knit communities where fear could spread quickly. It was here, in the early 1400s, that some of the earliest large-scale trials unfolded. Accused witches were said to gather in secret places, sometimes on mountaintops, sometimes in meadows under the moon. Stories told of feasts, of flying through the night, and of oaths sworn to the devil. These were not yet the great waves of panic that would come later, but they marked a turning point. Witchcraft was being imagined as an organized threat, not just a neighbor's curse. One of the most striking early episodes was the Valais witch trials, beginning around 1428 in what is now Switzerland. Over the course of several years, hundreds of people were accused, questioned, and condemned. The records show confessions that speak of Sabbaths, of magic pacts, of harmful spells. Torture played its role in producing these confessions, and once spoken, the words carried weight, convincing judges that the danger was real. The trials spread from village to village, leaving behind fear and suspicion. In France, too, notable cases appeared. In the region of Dauphiné, trials in the mid-15th century echoed the themes of Alpine Europe. Judges reported witches gathering in groups, worshipping the devil, and conspiring to harm the community. What had once been scattered local fears now appeared in the eyes of authorities as part of a wider and more organized conspiracy. The case of Joan of Arc, though not a witch trial in the strictest sense, also belongs to this world of fear and accusation. Tried in 1431, Joan was charged with heresy, but among the accusations were whispers of magic, of using charms, of hearing voices not from God but from darker sources. Her condemnation and execution remind us how easily the boundary between heresy, sorcery, and witchcraft could blur. These early trials are significant not just for their size but for the ideas they spread. For the first time, witches were described as gathering in groups, attending Sabbaths, and working together in service of the devil. The image of the solitary village witch was giving way to something larger, more menacing, a supposed underground society devoted to evil. This idea, though shaped by fear and imagination, would become central to later hunts. It is important to remember, though, that these trials were not yet everywhere. They were sparks, not yet wildfires, but they showed a change in the climate of belief, and once recorded, they began to influence how judges, priests, and rulers thought about witchcraft. The seeds of larger hunts were being planted, carried forward in records, sermons, and fearful whispers. We can picture these Alpine valleys, the courtrooms of Dauphiné, the anxious whispers that filled the air. These were not yet the great panics of later centuries, but they were early tremors, signs of the storms to come. And in our next step, we will turn to one of the most famous books ever written on witchcraft, a text that gave shape to fear and lent authority to the hunts that followed. The Malleus Maleficarum. As the 15th century drew to a close, the whispers of witchcraft had already begun to take shape in trials and rumors. But what truly gave those whispers a louder, more enduring voice was a book. Printed in 1487, in the early decades of Europe's new printing culture, it bore a heavy title, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. The book was written by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, though most historians believe Kramer was the true author. He had already been involved in witch trials in Germany, where his severe and obsessive views on witchcraft had met with resistance from local authorities. When his efforts were questioned, he sought to give his arguments greater force by putting them into a single text, one that could travel farther than his own voice. The Malleus was divided into three main sections. The first argued that witches were real, that their powers came from the devil, and that denying their existence was itself heresy. The second described the supposed practices of witches, flying through the night, casting curses, spoiling crops, killing infants, and attending Sabbaths where the devil presided. The third laid out instructions for judges, how to investigate, how to question, how to extract confessions, and ultimately, how to condemn. The language of the book was sharp, uncompromising, and filled with certainty. Where earlier voices in the church had hesitated, doubting whether witches could truly wield such powers, the Malleus thundered with assurance. Witches were everywhere, it declared. They were women more often than men, weak in faith, prone to temptation, and dangerous when allied with Satan. It was not enough to dismiss them as harmless superstition. They were enemies of God and society, and they had to be rooted out. Yet it is important to note that the book did not immediately become the universal guide it is sometimes imagined to be. Many theologians and judges were skeptical of Kramer's harsh views. Some dismissed his writing as extreme. In fact, the University of Cologne formally condemned the book shortly after it appeared. For decades it circulated quietly rather than explosively. But time worked in its favor. The printing press ensured that copies spread, reaching courts and libraries across Europe. As fears of witches grew in the 16th century, judges and preachers found in the Malleus a ready-made handbook that confirmed their suspicions. Its authority grew not because it was immediately embraced, but because it was there, available, insistent, and full of vivid descriptions that gave form to the anxieties of the age. The Malleus Maleficarum is also a window into the mindset of its author. Kramer seemed obsessed not only with the devil's power, but with women in particular. Page after page dwelled on female weakness, on supposed lust, on the danger of women stepping beyond their traditional roles. In this way, the book helped tie the image of the witch more firmly to gender, a link that would shape many of the trials to come. For listeners today, the book may sound almost like a dark fantasy, filled with wild claims and fearful exaggerations. But in its time, it was part of a larger struggle over belief. Was witchcraft real? Were people truly consorting with demons? Could misfortune be traced to hidden pacts with Satan? For Kramer, the answer was yes, absolutely, and he wrote with a fervor that left little room for doubt. And so the Malleus stands as both a book and a symbol, a book that did not invent the witch hunts but gave them fuel, and a symbol of how fear can be codified, given rules and procedures, and made to seem rational even when it is not. As the story unfolds, one question drifts to the surface again and again. Why were women so often the ones accused of witchcraft? Men too were sometimes tried, and in certain regions they made up a sizable portion of the accused. Yet across Europe, the image that lingered and the reality in many courts was that witches were mostly women. The reasons are layered, woven from culture, religion, and daily life. The Malleus Maleficarum itself had sharpened the association, insisting that women were more susceptible to the devil because they were, in the eyes of its author, weaker in faith, more easily deceived, and more given to desire. These claims reflected not objective truth, but the gender assumptions of the age, assumptions that painted women as fragile, unstable, and dangerous when left unchecked. In the villages and towns of Europe, suspicion often clung to women who lived at the edges of community life. A widow without the protection of a husband, a healer who used herbs others did not understand, a midwife present at the most delicate moments of life and death, all could become easy targets. Their independence, or simply their visibility, made them vulnerable. But there was more to it than independence. Property disputes often played their part. Inheritance laws and village customs meant that a widow might control land that neighbors coveted, or a woman without heirs might seem like a burden to her kin. To accuse her of witchcraft was not only to remove her but also to shift property and wealth. What looked like superstition was sometimes sharpened by very practical concerns. Even within families, tensions could spill into accusations. A quarrel between sisters, a fight over dowries, a dispute over childcare, all could spark whispers. Once spoken aloud, a rumor could grow until it reached the ears of a judge. In such ways, the witch hunts were not only about theology or law, but about the fragile fabric of everyday life. The stereotype of the old crone, bent and wrinkled, became a symbol of the witch in the popular imagination. She represented fear of age, fear of poverty, and fear of the unknown. But behind that image were real women, with lives, families, and histories, caught in webs of suspicion they could not untangle. And yet it is important to remember that men were not absent from this story. In parts of France and Scandinavia, large numbers of men were accused, sometimes because they worked as shepherds or healers, roles linked to both magic and misfortune. In some regions, whole groups of men were brought to trial together, their supposed crimes echoing the same patterns of pact and Sabbath that women were accused of elsewhere. So the gendered nature of witchcraft accusations was never absolute, but it was strong enough to leave a lasting mark. When we think of witches today, we imagine women, not men. That cultural memory, born from centuries of fear and trial, continues to shape the way stories are told. As we let this thought settle, it reminds us that the witch hunts were as much about society's anxieties as they were about real events. Fear of women's independence, fear of loss, fear of change, all found their outlet in the figure of the witch. To truly understand the world in which witchcraft took root, we must pause and step gently into the mindset of medieval Europe. For the people of that age, the world was not divided between the natural and the supernatural the way we think of it today. Instead, everything was intertwined. Every illness, every storm, every stroke of fortune was believed to be part of a larger web of forces, visible and invisible. The Christian faith shaped much of this worldview. Angels and demons were thought to move constantly among humans, guiding, tempting, protecting, or destroying. Saints were believed to intercede for the faithful, their relics carrying power to heal or to bless. The Church itself offered rituals for every stage of life: baptism, marriage, burial, each seen not only as symbolic, but as spiritually effective, with real power to safeguard souls. Alongside these official teachings, countless everyday practices filled the lives of ordinary people. Charms were carried against illness, herbs brewed to protect cattle, prayers whispered before planting seeds. A pilgrim might travel miles to touch a relic, or a mother might tie a simple string around her child's wrist to keep away the evil eye. None of these things were seen as strange. They were the normal rhythm of a world in which unseen forces constantly brushed against human life. It was within this atmosphere that witchcraft was understood. The idea that someone could call upon hidden powers to harm or to heal did not seem unbelievable. After all, the Church itself taught that miracles were real, that the devil had power, that saints could intervene. The boundary between miracle, magic, and witchcraft was never sharp. Instead, it depended on intention, authority, and community trust. If a charm was blessed by a priest, it might be seen as holy. If it was whispered by a neighbor in secret, it might be seen as dangerous. The presence of demons in this worldview is especially important. Medieval theology, from Augustine onward, held that demons could not create life or alter the natural order, but they could deceive, torment, and trick. This meant that whenever something unexplainable happened, a child's sudden illness, a crop's sudden failure, or even a dream, it was natural for people to see the hand of the devil, sometimes working through human agents. The witch was imagined as one such agent, a person who had allowed the devil to act through them. It is also worth remembering that magic was not always condemned. Learned scholars studied astrology, believing that the stars influenced human affairs. Physicians used complex mixtures of herbs, minerals, and prayers. Alchemists searched for ways to transform metals and prolong life. Much of what we might call magic was, in their eyes, part of the serious study of the world. What separated acceptable practices from condemned ones was often who performed them, under what authority, and with what result. So the world of the Middle Ages was thick with meaning. A candle lit in church, a prayer said at dawn, a charm whispered over a sick animal. All these were threads in a fabric that bound the visible to the invisible. Witchcraft was feared not because it seemed unreal, but precisely because it seemed too real, too close, too possible. As we let this understanding sink in, it becomes clear that witchcraft was never just about witches. It was about a whole world view, where every shadow carried a presence, every blessing had a power, and every misfortune begged for an explanation. In such a world, to accuse someone of witchcraft was to say they had stepped to the wrong side of the great divide between God and the devil. As the medieval centuries gave way to the early modern age, Europe began to change in ways that touched nearly every aspect of life. These shifts were slow, like rivers carving valleys, yet over time, they reshaped the landscape of belief, power, and fear. And with them, the story of witchcraft entered a new and darker chapter. The world of the Middle Ages had been intensely local. Most people lived their entire lives within the reach of a few miles, bound to villages, fields, and churches. Accusations of witchcraft were part of these local disputes, woven into quarrels between neighbors, whispered fears about healers, or the occasional judgment of a local court. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, the world was becoming larger and more connected. And in this larger world, small fears could suddenly become much greater. One powerful force behind this shift was the printing press. Invented in the mid-15th century, it transformed the way ideas spread. Where once knowledge was copied slowly by hand, now pamphlets and books could travel across borders, carrying stories, rumors, and arguments to distant places. For witchcraft, this meant that local fears could suddenly take on a pan-European voice. The publication of books like the Malleus Maleficarum gave shape and authority to fears that might once have remained vague. Another force was the rise of centralized states. Kings and princes, eager to strengthen their power, extended their reach into matters of law and belief. Where medieval justice had often been handled at the village level, now royal courts and regional authorities took greater interest. Witchcraft, once a neighborly quarrel, became something states believed they should control. Trials grew larger, sentences harsher, and accusations harder to escape. At the same time, Europe was rocked by religious division. The Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century split the unity of Western Christianity. What followed were decades of conflict, wars, and mutual suspicion between Catholics and Protestants. In this atmosphere, fears of the devil and his supposed human servants intensified. Each side accused the other of corruption, heresy, and devilry. And in this climate of suspicion, witches became a powerful symbol of evil lurking within communities. We must remember, however, that this shift was gradual. In many places, medieval patterns of small accusations continued. But the mood of Europe had changed. Where earlier centuries had often dismissed witchcraft as superstition or fraud, the early modern age treated it with new seriousness. Learned judges, royal officials, and even university scholars debated its dangers. The invisible world of angels and demons was still very real, but now it was drawn into the struggles of politics, faith, and authority. This was also an age of greater fear. Plagues still swept through cities, wars ravaged the countryside, and famines struck with merciless force. In times of hardship, the need to explain suffering grew stronger, and where explanations faltered, witchcraft often filled the gap. It was easier in a way to blame a neighbor for failed crops than to accept the randomness of nature or the cruelty of war. So as Europe crossed the threshold from the Middle Ages into the early modern era, witchcraft shifted too. From local quarrels, it became part of national anxieties. From whispers, it became the subject of books. From superstition, it became a matter of state law and church doctrine. And in this transformation, the stage was set for the most violent witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Yet even here, we must remember the calming truth. Not every place burned with the same fury. Some regions saw only a handful of trials. Others, caught in storms of fear and politics, saw hundreds. The reality was uneven, complex, and deeply human. One of the most persistent beliefs about the witch hunts is that they claimed millions of lives, that Europe was covered in flames from endless bonfires, and that whole villages were reduced to ashes through accusation and fear. This image has become almost as legendary as the witches themselves, a tale retold in films, novels, and even some school books. Yet when we slow down and look closely, the truth is different. The witch hunts were terrible, yes, and the suffering was real, but the numbers were not in the millions. They were far fewer, though still tragic. Modern historians, after careful research through trial records, legal archives, and parish accounts, estimate that across 3 centuries of witch trials, roughly from the 15th to the 18th century, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. That number is heavy with sorrow, but it is not the vast sea of millions that popular imagination has conjured. How then did the myth grow so large? In part, it came from the way later generations remembered the past. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, who were often critical of both the church and of superstition, sometimes exaggerated the scale of the witch hunts to make a sharper contrast between their own age of reason and the so-called darkness of earlier centuries. For them, the image of millions lost served as a warning of what happens when ignorance rules. The myth also grew through the fires of 19th and 20th century retellings. Romantic writers seeking drama painted pictures of endless executions. Political movements, too, used the witch hunts as symbols. Some feminists rightly pointed to the gendered nature of accusations, but inflated the numbers to emphasize the scope of women's suffering. In each case, the memory of the hunts was reshaped to serve new stories, often well-intentioned, but not always careful with the facts. When we hold this truth gently in our hands, the history becomes both smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because it was not millions. Larger because 40 to 60,000 real lives, mothers, fathers, children, neighbors, were swept away by fear, suspicion, and the machinery of law. To imagine each one as a person, not a statistic, is to feel the weight of what happened more deeply than any exaggerated number could give us. And when we set those deaths against the broader backdrop of the times, we find a clearer picture. Plagues killed millions in a single generation. Wars, such as the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, devastated entire regions, leaving villages empty. Famine and disease were far more constant killers than any witch trial. The witch hunts, in comparison, were devastating but episodic. Flames that flared, often under specific conditions, and then subsided. Understanding this truth does not lessen the sorrow. Rather, it helps us see the witch hunts for what they truly were. Not a monolithic wave of destruction sweeping across all of Europe, but a patchwork of tragedies, concentrated in certain places and times, shaped by local tensions, political struggles, and spiritual fears. When we think back over the story of the witch hunts, what lingers is not only the trials themselves, but the way they have lived on in memory. The images of witches at the stake, of haunted villages, of women accused in whispers. These have become part of our shared imagination. They are woven into novels, into plays, into films, and into the folklore that children grow up hearing. And yet, what we remember is often not the precise history, but the shadow of it, shaped and reshaped across centuries. The reality, as we have gently uncovered, was complex. The hunts were uneven, never as universal as myths suggest. The numbers, though tragic, were far smaller than the legends of millions. The accused were not always old women alone in cottages. They were neighbors, healers, midwives, sometimes men, sometimes entire families. The trials were born not only of superstition, but of social strain, political ambition, religious conflict, and the deep human need to explain suffering. So why do these stories endure so strongly? Perhaps it is because they speak to fears that are timeless. The fear of the outsider, the fear of hidden harm, the fear that our neighbors might not be what they seem. To look at the witch hunts is to look at how fragile trust can be, and how quickly fear can grow when stirred by rumor and authority. But there is another reason the memory persists. The hunts have become symbols. For some, they symbolize the dangers of superstition. For others, they represent the persecution of women, the silencing of the powerless, or the cruelty of institutions. In each retelling, history is shaped to carry meaning for the present. And while exaggerations can cloud the truth, the very act of remembering shows how deeply the past still matters. In a quieter sense, the story of the witch hunts reminds us of the resilience of communities. For though thousands were lost, countless more resisted, questioned, or refused to believe the charges. Many trials ended in acquittal. Many villages never saw a single burning. Human compassion, skepticism, and reason were always present, even in the darkest moments. As we drift to the end of this long journey, let us hold the witch hunts not as endless flames of fear, but as lessons carried forward. They show us how stories can grow larger than reality, how fear can shape justice, and how myths can last longer than facts. And yet they also remind us that history, when approached with patience, care, and gentleness, can teach us more than just what happened. It can teach us about ourselves, our hopes, our fears, our struggles, and our need for meaning. So now, as the night settles around us, let the myths fall quiet, and let the truth rest softly in your thoughts. The story of the medieval witch hunts is not only about witches, or trials, or executions. It is about people, their lives, their losses, and their legacies. It is about how communities respond to fear, and how, even centuries later, we still seek to understand. And with that, our tranquil journey through this misunderstood past comes gently to its end. May the calmness of history carry you into peaceful rest, and may the lessons of yesterday whisper softly into tomorrow.